and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be looking at the bias against Israel in the international nations, and also the latest investigation launched by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Warm welcome to the programme. In today's programme, I'm joined by Andrew Tucker in the Netherlands, who is the Director of Think at the Hague Initiative, as well as Michael McCann, the Director of Israel-Britain Alliance. I know you both very well, so it's an absolute pleasure that you can join me on this home edition of the Middle East Report.
Thanks, Simon.
Firstly, I'll start off with you, Andrew. Can you just share with us a little bit of the work that you're doing in terms of the Hague Initiative and your role as an international lawyer standing up and fighting for Israel in these international courts?
Thanks, Simon. So the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, we set up 3 years ago. We felt there was a need for a European-based think tank looking at international law issues connected with Israel, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and more broadly, Israel's position in the region. You know, we're all familiar with the biased approach towards Israel, especially from a European perspective, very solution-oriented approach to international law. Seems the Europeans have a view about the solution that should come out of this conflict. And at the same time, they ask Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians effectively with its hands tied behind its back. And just more problematically, I think generally there's a lot of confusion about Israel, you know, how the state was created, how its borders are supposed to be determined. Is a Jewish state is it discriminatory? Is it an apartheid state? What is the occupation? All of these issues where people talk about international law in simplistic terms, but in actual fact, law is much more complicated and perhaps less definitive than many people would like to think. And perhaps it doesn't really offer the answers that some people would like it to offer. So we are creating an international network of lawyers to just think about the issues and think about different paradigm for the way forward, because the paradigm that we're stuck in now for 20 or 30 years since Oslo has failed. We need to look at this whole thing afresh and revisit some of the assumptions that are current, and that's what our work's about.
Excellent. Well, I know that you do great work, Andrew, so really appreciate you being on the programme today. And Michael, you have a new campaign that you want to share with our viewers, and that is confronting the bias against Israel at the United Nations and the role that Britain can play in defending the only democracy in the Middle East, that is Israel.
Yeah, well, actually, there's 2 campaigns live at the moment, Simon. It's a busy period. We have the campaign against bias at the UN, and we've just started their campaign against Israel Apartheid Week. If you're involved in Israel advocacy, there's never any shortage of issues live at any given time that you can deal with. But the campaign on UN bias is really, really important, because we know that most of the countries in the United Nations are not democracies, and yet people on the street would say, well, if the United Nations have said it, it must be correct. And of course, we had the rather bizarre situation a couple of weeks ago where Australia was censured by North Korea for not having enough free press. So this is the situation that we face with the United Nations, and then in particular in its relationship with Israel. It's beyond belief that the number of times that Israel is castigated and condemned at the United Nations. But What we really want to focus on, as you know, we are the Israel-Britain alliance for a reason, because we're a UK advocacy outfit, is the UK voting record, because people would think that the Conservative administration in charge of the UK governance at the moment would have some sort of affinity with the state of Israel, given its long-term connections and going back to Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is, there have been 112 motions passed at the United Nations General Assembly since 2015, and our government has voted against Israel 82 times, has abstained 27 times, and has only supported Israel on 3 occasions. Now, this is a government, the UK government, that describes itself as a friend of Israel. My goodness, I wouldn't like to see it if it was being an enemy of Israel. So our campaign highlights those issues, and it's asking MPs, because supporters will write to those MPs and say, give us a justification for the position that you're taking in Israel, because you're standing alongside North Korea, Yemen, Iran, and Syria, some of the most horrendous regimes in the world, condemning the only democratic state in the Middle East, the state of Israel.
Yeah, and we now have a video to go to now, and this one is produced by Michael himself, which will educate us regarding the UN bias against Israel, and particularly the role that our government is playing with these anti-Israel UN resolutions. Take a look.
Corruption is criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust. Corruption is criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust. Corruption is criminal, immoral, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust.
Mr. Guterres leads the United Nations, and since 2015, his organization has passed 112 motions against Israel. Over the same period, the UN has passed 19 motions criticizing Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Mr. Guterres is a hypocrite. Out of those 112 votes, the UK government voted with Iran, North Korea, and Syria 82 times, and abstained 27 times. If you agree that the UK government is also guilty of hypocrisy in failing to support the only democracy in the Middle East, join our campaign at www.israelbritain.org.uk/UN-fail.
And it's so important that we get behind these campaigns produced by Israel-Britain Alliance, because it's so important that we all play a role in defending the Jewish state. Now, Andrew, how have we got into a situation when it was actually the United Nations that helped birth the modern state of Israel, and yet in 2021 we find that virtually the entire United Nations is essentially biased against Israel and condemns Israel 100 times over compared to despotic nations like Iran, North Korea, Syria, to name but a few?
Well, Simon, let's go back to 1948 when the State of Israel was created. The UN had been in existence for 3 years. It was created in 1945. It effectively replaced the League of Nations, which had become a totally ineffective instrument for achieving justice, and certainly was not a friend of the Jewish people. I think actually it's a misconception to think that the UN was favorable towards Israel even when it was created. Although, see, Israel was created in May 1948. The UN was nowhere to be seen when the Arab nations attacked Israel the day after it was created. They were nowhere to be seen in the months prior to that with Arab terrorism and the threat of annihilation from the Arab world around it. And then it was almost a year later that Israel was accepted as a UN member. But the state of Israel was not created by the United Nations. United Nations doesn't create states. It doesn't even recognize them. It's states, other states that recognize. So Israel's existence doesn't depend on the UN. It also doesn't depend on the recognition by other states, at least on one approach to international law. It exists because it exists. It's a state. And it doesn't need the UN's imprimatur or approval or consent for its existence, even for what it does really. So I think even in 1948-49, it was problematic. The voting was, you know, I'm researching at the moment the position of the Netherlands, Germany, France, and the UK, right from 1945 through to, let's say, the mid-1980s. And it's not a very pretty story. And although they recognized Israel, there was a lot of internal discussion about whether or not to do it, and it was all driven by self-interest. So I think the UN is a very well-meaning and it's well-intended institution, but already from the beginning it was, I think, exposed to the weakness that we've seen, and you know, Michael has just described it, that it's driven by power blocks, by political blocks, and they vote according to their own self-interest. And if they think black is white or white is black, then that's the way they will vote. So the UN has never really been a friend of Israel. It's got worse, I agree, but I think the foundations of the UN, even if you look at the way that the UN Charter was drafted towards the end of 1945, the Jewish people, they barely had a seat at the table, despite the fact that the UN was created off the back of the Holocaust and the Shoah. All the Jewish attempts to present their case, to be at the table, were effectively rejected because the great powers of the time had other interests in mind. They had other concerns, and so I'm not entirely optimistic about the UN. And I think, you know, we can come in a moment to talk about just, you know, what are the ideological interests that drive these blocks of parties. But by its nature, I think the UN is not interested in a small state that doesn't fit within the paradigm that we would all like it to fit into. It just doesn't, it's a square peg fitting into a round hole, or round whatever it is. Just doesn't fit.
Angie, I really appreciate that historic perspective, and it's extraordinary to think that Israel's first ambassador to the United Nations, Abri Ban, Israel's finest ever spokesman, you had to read up on international law, had to read up on international how the international system works, and because he'd read up on it, he was the most qualified to become Israel's new ambassador, despite him being Israel's ambassador to UN at such a young age. And he made a huge difference in trying to get the support and recognition by UN member states. So really appreciate your historic insight there. And Michael, according to your campaign notes on your UN bias campaign, you note that from 2015 to 2020, the United Nations has condemned the Islamic Republic of Iran, North Korea, and Syria a total of 19 times. But the same international organization has condemned Israel 112 times, as you mentioned earlier in the program. How is it possible that the only democratic state in the Middle East that has freedom of worship for the three major religions, such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and opens those sites to all, has a free press, democratic institutions, is so condemned by the United Nations and the Security Council? What possible answer could there be that Israel's being singled out on the international stage?
Well, Andrew's just given it. It's the different power blocks within it that drive. It's not goodness or hope or fairness. It's none of those things that drive the United Nations. It's the interests of the countries concerned. And of course, when you speak about the three Abrahamic faiths, in countries like North Korea, and Russia and others aren't interested in any faith whatsoever. So there's one example of a motivation. The other motivation is that up until recently, virtually every country in the Middle East has desired that Israel does not exist anymore. You know, remember the 1948 war, the 1960s. I mean, there was no, and I put my inverted commas up here, there was no occupation between 48 and 67. Every time the wind changes and there's a different dimension to the Israel-Palestinian issue, its opponents create a new issue to hate Israel, to detest Israel for. That's what they do. So therefore, the whole thing about settlements, etc., is a big issue for people who claim that the land is illegally occupied. And as Andrew has explained, that international law isn't as simple as that. And then you say, well, in between 48 and 67, there was no occupation. So what was your problem with that period? And of course, it boils down to this: they do not want the state of Israel to exist. And my own analysis of it, because I'm concerned about what the UK government does in particular, is that Israel was the weak partner when it was created, and it was attacked by the armies, the 5 Arab armies back in 1948, the day after it had declared its independence. Nobody came to its aid. 2,000 Holocaust survivors died in the war with the Arab nations, but tiny Israel won. It overcame all the odds. They couldn't believe it, that tiny Israel had won. So the situation is they tried to defeat it militarily, tried again in 67 to defeat it militarily, tried again in 73, moved on to the terrorism because they knew they couldn't defeat Israel by normal conventional standard mechanisms, and they went to asymmetrical warfare. And so therefore, there's a whole history. You would think that anyone with a shred of decency and fairness inside themselves and able to analyse things without a bias would reach the conclusion that you should support Israel for everything that's been through, and you should be thoroughly ashamed, particularly the UK government, for behaving the way it has done. But there's loads of motivations in there. The one that we're trying to crack and find out about is what on earth is the UK government playing at? We're a democracy, the oldest democracy on the planet, arguably, and we're in a position where we're not supporting another democratic state, and we're siding with totalitarian regimes against that democracy. It's a scandal, quite frankly. And I think it's down to the fact that the vast majority of the ordinary British public don't take that much notice of foreign affairs.
No, thank you for raising those important issues, particularly when it comes to Israel. Andrew, we often hear these awful UN resolutions attacking Israel. So the big question is, for our viewers, what are these UN security resolutions, and are they internationally binding?
Okay, so I think it's important, first of all, to understand the UN is a political institution. It's the Charter of the UN was set up to, obviously promote world peace and security. The two main bodies are the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly is, by definition, a political body, passes resolutions every day on all kinds of things. Not just on the big conflicts in the world, but from all kinds of issues which people think might help the world. They're political resolutions. No General Assembly resolution has any binding effect whatsoever. The most that could be said is that the voting of member states in resolutions could be evidence of customary international law. International law consists of, it's primarily customary international law, so it depends on what states do. And a rule or principle only exists if you have a universal or near universal number of states who consider that principle to be a binding principle of law. So the very fact of just passing a resolution, and many of the resolutions, by the way, are just passed by a majority of states. As Michael said, in relation to the UK, the same can be said of many other states. They often abstain, or they simply don't vote, or they're not even present at the meeting that a resolution is being voted on. And often these very anti-Israel resolutions are passed by a majority, sometimes a bare majority of states. So they're not evidencing universal view. about a principle. So they're very weak evidentiary value in terms of international law. Just to give you an example, one of the key ones that is really the basis now of this International Criminal Court proceedings was the resolution 29th of November 2012, adopting or accepting Palestine as a non-member UN observer state. Now, that was a problematic resolution because actually a lot of states didn't vote for it or voted against it, or if they voted, they said in their comments they didn't actually mean what they said. And so you have a resolution which says Palestine is a state, but everybody knows it's not a state. And yet it's accepted in the international community as being evidence of a state when in fact it's not. So it's a clear case of creating something which doesn't exist. And we can mention many more of these resolutions. Security Council is a little different. There've been a number of Security Council resolutions regarding Israel. The most famous one is 242 after the Six-Day War, which set out a so-called framework for peace negotiations. But again, it's not international law in the sense that it creates law. The Security Council doesn't create international law. It can reflect it. It can be evidence of international law. And secondly, it's not binding. None of these Security Council resolutions are binding because they're not taken under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And Chapter 7 resolutions are the only ones under the Charter that are binding. And there's not been a single Israel-related resolution under Chapter 7. So they're all soft law, we would call them. They're important, they're politically very important, but they're not legally binding.
I appreciate that. And Michael, how much of Britain really going against Israel in the United Nations is being influenced, would you say, by the Foreign Office? And how much does our Prime Minister Boris Johnson fully know the extent of Britain's involvement against Israel at the United Nations? Well, I don't think they only voted against 3 resolutions in 5 years is shocking for a so-called ally of Israel.
Well, I don't think the UK's record is any surprise whatsoever to Boris Johnson. And if you think back just to UNSCR 2334, which was a resolution which was worked up when Barack Obama was just about to leave office, and there was a sly deal done behind the scenes where the US said it wouldn't veto the resolution. So what happened is they asked Britain to speak to another nation. I think it was New Zealand who was on the Security Council at the time to create this resolution against Israel, which would then be voted on because the US would abstain and wouldn't veto. Then it would be passed. And that was criticising Israel for the allegedly illegal settlements, which of course is very dubious in international law. So the position is that Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary then. So therefore, and he was told, because we ran a campaign immediately, they done it very slyly because it was one of those years where Christmas and Hanukkah came together in terms of the date cycle. And we had to start a campaign very quickly over Christmas and New Year, got thousands of signatures to bring it to the people's attention about this skullduggery taking place. And so there's absolutely nothing new in it. And I think it's very disheartening that our government behaves this way. But what we want to do is expose their behaviour and let people know what they're doing. So they're saying one thing and then they're doing the polar opposite. And because Israel is a strong state now, militarily and in its democracy, then it's moved on from 1948 when it was seen to be the weak force, and potentially that's why that 5 Arab armies attacked, because they thought they could win. And Israel miraculously won. They've now been a feature in the Middle East for decades. And the bottom line is that because they couldn't defeat Israel militarily, they moved the battleground to international organizations like the UN and the International Criminal Court. And that's why the battle now is to drag Israel down reputationally in order that it can be described as a rogue state and a state that cannot be supported. And Britain is complicit in that agenda because the Arabist Foreign Office, which wants to keep on selling military aircraft to states in the Middle East, So it says that we'll do business with those states, we'll criticise Israel, but privately we'll tell Israel, we're your friend, really. Don't worry about how we vote. But, you know, you can't do those two things. If you're a friend, you're a friend. You can't say you're a friend and then behave like an enemy. And so therefore, there's a reckoning coming in. The part that I don't quite understand at the moment, and I would have to hear someone from government explain this to me, with Iran's hegemony in the Middle East leading to the Abraham Accords and the strengthening of relationships between Arab nations and Israel, why on earth is the Arabist Foreign Office not changing its position? I'm not quite sure about the machinations behind the scenes that are going on, but I would have thought that that would have led to a change in the FCO position, or the FCDO as it's now known, with development added in. And I hope some way down the road we'll get that change, and we'll get a more, not conciliatory, a more the actions of a friend taking place rather than the actions of an opponent at the United Nations.
And that's a very good question that we need to answer, the Foreign Office to answer, particularly Dominic Raab as well, our Foreign Secretary. With the changes going on in the Middle East, why is the British government not supporting Israel in the UN, even though it looks like the Saudis and the Gulf states probably will? Andrew, I have to ask you really for our viewers that when it comes to the United Nations and these global institutions, they're very complicated, but all of them seem to take a role in condemning Israel. We have the likes of the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, and then UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency that deals solely with the so-called Palestinian refugees. Why is it all these big globalist institutions that are linked to the UN are so biased against Israel?
Well, it's the million-dollar question, I suppose, we're all trying to sort of grapple with. But I guess that all comes down to the same thing. They're all, at the end of the day, they're run by the states that are on them. So if you look at UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, we've already touched on, you know, the sorts of states that are on the council are the ones that are least interested in supporting the state of Israel for different reasons. It's ideological or religious or political, but it doesn't suit them to support the state of Israel. So I think all of these institutions are really tainted by the same problem. At the end of the day, they're very political in nature, and they say they're governed by the rule of law. And I think this is part of the problem for Britain as well, is, you know, because we've created this legal paradigm over the last 70 years concerning the occupation of the territories, we now can't get out of that straitjacket because we think it's law and therefore it's legally binding, and therefore we can't change our policies because this is what we've set it to be. Whereas in actual fact, if you go back to the beginning, the foundations of that paradigm are flawed. And we can maybe speak about that more in a moment. So I can't explain it in a way better than that, except to say that, you know, again, every nation is driven by its own ideological agenda, and Israel is simply, I think, the scapegoat in all of this. It doesn't suit to stick up for Israel because it means standing up against so many others who are not in favour.
Good explanation. Thank you, Andrew. And let's have a look at this excellent CBN report that looks at UN bias against Israel and even doubting the spiritual and biblical connection between Israel and her eternal capital, Jerusalem, and the Jewish people.
Israel's ambassador to the UN said the vote proved the UN General Assembly was, quote, detached from reality, and said it was a disgrace. He pointed out that in contrast to the UN vote, a growing number of nations are acknowledging that Jerusalem is the undeniable capital of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. The representative of the Palestinian Authority said the resolution was fully in line with international law. While 138 countries approved the measure, 9 voted against it, including Israel and the United States. The vote comes while the United States is encouraging more nations to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move their embassies there. The African nation of Malawi is the latest country to signal it will move its embassy. Malawi's foreign minister met Thursday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So far, only the United States and Guatemala have moved their embassies to Jerusalem. One encouraging note for Israel is that the number of countries that supported the text of the UN resolution dropped from 154 last year to 138 this year. That could be a sign of growing recognition of Israel's claim to its ancient capital and the influence of the Abraham Accords. According to the Bible, the Temple Mount is the location of the first and second Jewish temples, first built under King Solomon, then rebuilt hundreds of years later after Israel went into exile. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Michael, I have to ask you regarding this campaign, how can our viewers get involved, and what can they do to put pressure on our members of parliament, to put pressure on the Foreign Office to stand up for Israel in the United Nations?
Well, all our live campaigns are on our website at www.israelbritain.org.uk under live campaigns. And what we do, as you know, is that many supporters of Israel don't have the confidence, find it difficult to put into words their thoughts about Israel. So we make it easy for them. We create the templates with the letters to the members of parliament, and then we have the IT infrastructure, which allows individuals to simply join our campaigns by putting in their name and their address, and it's all filling box as if you were buying something from Argos or something like that. You just click in your postcode and all the fields are filled in, and then you can click off that letter, send it to your MP, and then you're asking your MP to take action on your behalf. Because bear in mind, we live in a parliamentary democracy, which is broken down into constituencies, 650 across the whole of the United Kingdom. And each one of those constituencies is a member of parliament who's responsible for looking after those constituents. And therefore, those MPs are duty bound to respond. Now, you'll know that there'll be MPs across the political spectrum in the UK who don't support Israel. But it's equally important to put pressure on these guys, or these men and women, because they have to justify their actions too. And they can, if they don't believe that Israel's got a right to exist, let them explain why they believe that. Although many of them will be running scared from topics like that at the moment because of the whole anti-Semitism debate. But it means that in terms of this particular campaign, we're asking our supporters to do two things. One, to write to the Foreign Secretary and ask for an explanation of the British government's behaviour. You say you're a friend and this is how you behave. What on earth is going on? And the second issue is we're also inviting MPs to a virtual seminar, which Hillel Muir from UN Watch will be giving a briefing to members of the public and to members of Parliament, which takes place very soon. So the whole idea is to put the tough questions to members of Parliament, who in turn will put the tough questions to the Foreign Secretary, and to educate our politicians. Because I've said to you before, Simon, that MPs receive mailbags which include everything from free school milk to nuclear weapons and everything in between. And therefore, you can't possibly, I don't know any MP who's got the capability to intellectually master every single topic under the sun. But what you do expect them to do, once they receive an inquiry, is to research it, because they've got staff who are paid to do those things, to research it and come back with a response and to offer you their view. And far too often, they take the path of least resistance, something that Andrew spoke about earlier about why people vote against Israel. The path of least resistance is sometimes often more attractive than making a tough decision about whether to support Israel or to truly expose your views. Because by truly exposing your views, you'll let people know that at your heart, you're anti-Semitic.
Excellent, Michael. And for our viewers, please get involved in this campaign and put pressure on our parliamentary representatives as well as the Foreign Office, and let's hold them to account for their anti-Israel bias at the UN. Andrew, now we faced 4 years of President Trump and what I can only describe the great Nikki Haley as America's ambassador to the UN, where she defended Israel in the United Nations and did an incredible job. I'd like to see her become president one day. But now we have a new administration in the White House, in the Biden administration, and I don't think Israel's going to have the same level of protection that she had under President Trump. And even worse, we could see anti-Israel UN security resolutions being passed by this Biden administration against Israel in order to facilitate the establishment of a Palestinian state. What are your thoughts?
Well, I do think this administration is different from the Obama administration. Obviously, we've all been waiting to see who's filling in which positions. The key person, obviously, on this issue is the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who, as I read him, is a very different person from John Kerry. Kerry, I think, was very problematic. And by the way, I think Biden is different from Obama as well. It's democratic, and I think they're going down that their global worldview is one of consensus and reaching agreement, and the US being back at the table, as it were. So they certainly are very, very different from the Trump administration. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think part of the problem with the Trump administration is that he didn't necessarily bring others along with him. So he took some very important and I think good decisions, but it wasn't always well explained. Yeah. And I think people had a problem understanding why he did certain things. And I'd be hopeful that I think Blinken, who's much more of an intellectual as well, I think he's very sympathetic towards Israel, and I think understands Israel's position. I don't expect them to do a repeat of 2334. They don't need to, obviously, because 2334 is already on the books. They won't wind it back either necessarily, but I don't expect them to be pushing Palestinian statehood as much as the Obama administration did. And on that point, America has spoken out very quickly to criticize the recent decision of the International Criminal Court, which we'll come back to. And that's an indication, I think, that they don't see Palestine as a state yet, and that they do promote level playing field negotiations. So I'm not entirely unoptimistic at this point.
All I can say is I hope you're right. I have a feeling I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think time will tell. Let's have a look at this CBN report that looks into this investigation that the International Criminal Court in The Hague is going to investigate Israel.
The impact could be widespread, as the ruling includes Israelis who were involved in events ranging from Israel's 2014 war with Hamas to Palestinian mass demonstrations along the Gaza-Israeli border beginning in 2018.
That would mean Israeli politicians, Israeli leaders, Israeli officials, and most of all, of course, Israeli military members, basically for any acts which are alleged to be criminal that have been committed since July 2014.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blasted the decision.
When the ICC investigates Israel for fake war crimes, this is pure anti-Semitism. The court established to prevent atrocities like the Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish people is now targeting the one state of the Jewish people. First, it outrageously claims that when Jews live in our homeland, this is a war crime. Second, it claims that when democratic Israel defends itself against terrorists who murder our children, rocket our cities, we're committing another war crime.
Israel says for years Hamas has fired thousands of rockets indiscriminately into civilian areas, while they respond with targeted military responses. Hamas is also open to ICC investigations, but they applauded the move.
حماس تعتبر ذلك خطوة Hamas considers this an important step towards justice for our Palestinian people and prosecute the Israeli war criminals. The most important steps remain, taking practical measures on the ground to hold the Israeli war criminals accountable and punish them for their crimes and everything they have done against our unarmed people.
It could also mean Jewish communities in Israel's biblical heartland, also known as the West Bank, might be considered illegal, since the ICC calls this area occupied territory. It could put Israeli leaders and possibly civilians traveling to countries bound by the ICC treaty in danger.
Because they will be obliged by the treaty holding the ICC together to extradite suspects of the ICC to The Hague for interrogation, arrest, trial, or whatever may be.
International law expert David Benjamin says the decision has no basis in law and that Israel isn't the only loser.
This is worrying for international law generally, and it's very worrying too for people, and I myself was among them, who actually held out some hope for the International Criminal Court as being an important institution and a relevant institution in the world. Because by making this decision, which is so obviously political, it has really condemned itself to being branded as a political organization.
The 2-1 decision is not the final step. The matter now shifts to the ICC's chief prosecutor for a final decision to see if war crimes will be charged. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Michael, what do you make of the investigation announced on the 5th of February by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, that they are going to investigate Israel's activities in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza, especially Israel's military operation against Hamas in the summer of 2014?
Well, how can I say this? The International Criminal Court is a pantomime from start to finish. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's not recognised by the US. So even when you mentioned a few moments ago that the US say they're not recognising the decision, well, the US doesn't even recognise the court, and neither does Russia. So therefore, you know, when you've got these huge nations in the world who don't recognise the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and then you have the International Criminal Court actually turning its own rules on its head and making a statement about an investigation into something which does not exist. There is no state of Palestine. I wish there was, quite frankly. I wish there had been one in November 1947 when they proposed partition, but the Jewish representatives accepted, the Arabs didn't, and caused the war, and have caused every war and every terrorist act since. They're the catalyst for aggression and violence, and of course they've despicably put their own people into victimhood, which means that we have got organisations like UNRWA draining public purses full of corruption, and you know, making the conflict even worse every year by having a set of rules which create new refugees every year, rather than doing what the UNHRC does, which is reduce the number of refugees by supplanting them into different countries. So in terms of the ICC, I was speaking to my predecessor, because you'll recall that Adam Ingram was a member of parliament before me in my constituency before I took over from him. And Adam was the Minister of State in Northern Ireland and at the Ministry of Defence, the longest serving armed forces minister in modern times. And I spoke to Adam briefly, and he just said, look, we always thought the ICC was a joke, and I don't think the British government's position will be any different now. So there you have it. Even in Tony Blair's government, you had senior ministers believing that the ICC had no relevance whatsoever, and it was there to make headlines rather than dealing with the real issues.
I suppose the big question we have to ask with this latest investigation by the International Criminal Court, Andrew, is that how can the International Criminal Court in The Hague investigate Israel for alleged war crimes when the state of Palestine doesn't exist? It may have member status in the United Nations as a kind of associate state, but as far as the state is concerned, it's not an actual functioning state.
Well, what the court has decided is that under the Rome Statute, there's two ways the court can have jurisdiction. Either the crime has been committed by a national of a state party to the ICC, or it's been committed on the territory of a state party. Now, ICC was under a lot of pressure, obviously, to make this decision. The prosecutor, who, by the way, I think part of the big problem with all of this is the way the prosecutor has operated. She very quickly, when Palestine purported to accede to the ICC in 2015 on the back of the 2012 UN resolution, she was very quick to accept their request that she undertake to examine the situation. She met frequently with Palestinians. She was very open to the whole Arab paradigm, if you like. But she knew there was a problem with Palestinian statehood, so she passed the ball to the court. She said, well, you need to decide whether we have jurisdiction or not. Is Palestine a state for the purposes of the Rome Statute? And the court was under, the pre-trial chamber, under a lot of pressure to make the decision in favor of Palestine. Politically, a lot of the, because the ICC at the end of the day is run by its own state parties. It's not a UN body. It's its own institution, 123 member states, and many of them were pushing for the court to go down this route. And it took basically a cop-out, and it said, well, we're not going to decide whether it's a state or not. If the UN thinks it's a state, then that's good enough for us, which is a pretty hopeless and pathetic way of explaining your own jurisdiction. But politically, I can see them wanting to find a way out of, which is because whether or not Palestine is a state is, unfortunately, at the moment, under international law, a very controversial question. You have a lot of international lawyers who say that it is a state, even though it doesn't qualify according to the normal criteria of statehood. They say the concept of statehood has so changed, and we should abandon those old paradigms of statehood, and we should be looking to a new kind of international order. And the reason Palestine is not a state is because of the occupation. So let's treat it as a state in order to give it a place at the table. And these are the kinds of things that the court was wrestling with. I think at the end of the day, it's problematic, highly problematic, because it really does undermine the court's own authority, its own credibility. If it just turns to the UN General Assembly to give it the green light to move ahead or not move ahead, I think it's failed in its fundamental task of determining legally its own jurisdiction. That's what a court should be doing. And I think it's shown that in this way, it's not a real court. It's becoming a political institution. And sadly, I think we're going to see a lot of states will withdraw, or they will cause a fundamental reform of the court. We'll see what happens.
Michael, it's believed that the International Criminal Court in The Hague was set up to fight against genocide, particularly by dictators. And yet the Jewish people have faced the biggest genocide in world history in the Holocaust, and now being singled out for a Jewish state when the warfare they're engaged in is asymmetrical warfare. They're not state players, they're terrorist entities that hide behind women and children and fire rockets and missiles. So how can Israel then defend herself against these terrorist organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and now face the prospect of being investigated by the International Criminal Court for war crimes?
Well, the high-level military group, and you'll know Colonel Richard Kemp, who is a great friend of Israel, but he's not only a friend of Israel, he's a very well-respected former member of the British Army, along with people like General Dannett, who formed part of the high-level military group, investigated too strong a word. They visited the Gaza border dispute when it took place, and they saw firsthand the reactions of the IDF to the attacks that it was facing. And remember that you're talking about a conventional force in the IDF up against a non-conventional force who will use men, women, and children as cannon fodder, just in the same ways as battles of old, use them as cannon fodder to try and breach the other side's protections. So therefore, it is a bizarre situation that the IDF face, and it's all created by groups like Hamas, who don't care how many of their own people die in those circumstances. And Richard Kemp was actually speaking at an event that the Israel-Britain Alliance hosted in the House of Commons, where we had an Israeli NGO which had members of the IDF as part of it, and they were explaining the difficulties they faced. And Richard Kemp was asked a question: how would the British Army have handled the situation at the Gaza border? And his response was in exactly the same way as the IDF. He says it wasn't perfect, it couldn't be perfect, but we were facing, weaponry which could hurt not only members of the IDF, but if they had breached the border fence and with communities just, hundreds of yards past that border fence, ordinary Israelis would have died. And you have to put it into context. If someone was attacking Glasgow, London, Cardiff, or Belfast in the UK, and the British government didn't do its fundamental duty, which is to protect the citizens, it would be rightly deemed not to have fulfilled its duties. And that's what Israel did. And because they're fulfilling their duties and protecting their citizens, they are being brought before these. And forgive me for not using technical language, Andrew, but I view that as a complete kangaroo court in the form of the ICC, who are looking for ways, and it's all political, as you've quite rightly pointed out, and that's not how courts should exist. They should be completely free of political influence.
Absolutely. So we're down to the last 4.5 minutes of the programme, so really kind of to sum up. Andrew, what are the implications of this investigation by the International Criminal Court for Israel, and what are your long-term fears regarding this investigation?
Well, this is just the beginning, I think, Simon, of a long process. The court has simply decided on jurisdiction. The current prosecutor had already said back at the end of 2019 she intends to investigate Israeli and Palestinian war crimes. She's concerned about two kinds of Israeli war crimes. One is the Gaza conflict, use of proportional force and so forth. The second one, I think much more problematic, is settlements. And the idea that settlements are a war crime under the Rome Statute. This is the very reason, by the way, Israel never joined the ICC, because they knew this provision, Article 8.2b8, would be used against them as a political weapon. That's exactly what's happening. But there will be a new prosecutor who will come in June. It's the British leading international law crime QC Karim Khan. He's a very capable guy. He will have another look at this whole case and decide whether or not to go forward with an investigation. But if he does, it's going to be a very long process. I'm deeply concerned about them getting into the whole settlements issue, which is a deeply political issue. It doesn't belong in a criminal court. A criminal court can't decide whether or not Jews living in East Jerusalem or Judea and Samaria are a result of war crimes. So I think this is leading the court into an area that's never dealt with before, and I think it's a deep black hole which it's getting itself into. It will be years, decades maybe even, before any Israeli would ever come to be prosecuted before the court. And I think there's a likelihood it will be thrown out before that happens. So there's a lot of legal and factual hurdles which will need to be crossed. But obviously Israel now is going to fight back. They're not going to take this decision lightly. They're going to take action to, I think, challenge and attack the court and the Palestinians, because I think this is going to undermine the Palestinians. Any prospect that there was for cooperation with Israel, I think, is being destroyed by the way they're using the ICC to advance their political agenda, sadly.
And Michael, with about 1.5 minutes, how important is it that our viewers watching this programme today make a stand and really stand up for Israel where it matters in Parliament and also in the United Nations, because we know that Israel's going to go through another tough time with this new Biden administration.
Well, the bottom line is that there's only two ways to actually change political policy. They either join a political party and you try to change it from within through manifestos and policy forums and such like, or people power. And people power is making your views known. And if we all make our views known on the same issue at the same time, it creates a force and a momentum to get to the overriding goal, which is change. And so when people say to me often, Simon, or occasionally, it's more occasionally now, they say, oh, well, you know, does this really work? And I say, well, look, if I told you a story about an organization that started out causing all the fights in the world, and then it blamed someone else for them and said that they were now victims, would you believe that? And they say, well, no. And I say, well, that's what the Palestinians have done. The Palestinians have successfully changed aggression into victimhood. So there's an example of how it works. What we have to do is to stand up for what we believe in. And the really great thing about our situation is we have all the facts on our side and one big word, truth. So please, for your viewers, join the campaign. Every person we get contacting a politician means that there's more effort put in to ensure that this sort of stuff at the United Nations and ICC, one day we can regard it as history.
So, Michael, Andrew, thank you so much for being my guests on this home edition of the Middle East Report. And I want to thank you for watching this program today. Israel faces a real battle in the United Nations and now has a real battle with the International Criminal Court. And so, therefore, we will have to play a role in holding our governments to account that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East, is an ally of the West, and she needs our support. And we need to tell our governments that. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.